In this episode, we focus on a problem that causes a lot of friction in real organizations, even when everyone has good intentions. The controls you selected and planned still have to be implemented in a way that matches how the organization expects systems to be run and how compliance requirements must be met. It is not enough to say a control exists. It needs to exist in the right form, in the right place, with the right ownership, and with evidence that fits the standards you are being measured against. Alignment is the skill of making sure your system's control implementation fits the organization's policies, risk tolerance, and standard ways of operating, while also satisfying the external or internal compliance rules that apply. Beginners sometimes assume that if a control sounds reasonable and improves security, it will automatically be acceptable, but compliance work is full of cases where an implementation is secure yet still not acceptable because it does not match required processes or documentation conventions. The goal here is to help you implement controls in a way that fits the organization's expectations and creates a clean, defensible compliance story. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong place to begin is understanding that organizational expectations are not just preferences. They are often the mechanism that makes compliance scalable. Organizations establish standard approaches to identity, logging, configuration management, incident response, and vendor management because they want consistent outcomes across many systems. If each system team invents its own way of doing access control reviews or vulnerability tracking, compliance becomes hard to measure and hard to maintain. Alignment means you implement controls using the organization's standard services, standard processes, and standard documentation patterns whenever possible, because that creates consistency and reduces the chance of surprises. This does not mean you blindly follow tradition, because some standards might need improvement, but it does mean you treat organizational norms as important inputs. If the organization expects centralized identity for authentication, building an isolated local identity model is misaligned even if it is technically strong. If the organization expects centralized logging and incident response escalation through a defined process, running a private monitoring approach without coordination is misaligned even if it detects issues well. Alignment is about fitting into the system of systems. Compliance requirements, on the other hand, are the rules you must meet, and those rules may come from frameworks, contracts, regulations, or internal policy mandates. Compliance requirements usually care about control intent, evidence, and repeatability, not about whether your team is convinced the implementation is good. That means alignment includes understanding what evidence an assessor will accept and designing your implementation so that evidence naturally exists. For example, a control might require access to be approved and reviewed, and the compliance expectation is that approvals and reviews are documented, repeatable, and traceable to roles. If your team approves access verbally, you may still be doing the right thing in practice, but you will fail compliance because the required evidence is missing. Similarly, if you patch systems quickly but cannot show a record of patch decisions and timelines, you may be secure but non-compliant. Alignment is the craft of building security behaviors that produce acceptable proof. One of the most practical alignment moves is to compare your planned control implementation against the organization's existing policy and standard operating procedures and identify where you are deviating. Deviations are not automatically bad, but they must be intentional and justified because unintentional deviations create inconsistent risk and inconsistent evidence. For example, if the organization has a standard for log retention, your system should implement retention in that same way unless there is a reason it cannot. If the organization has a standard process for granting privileged access, your system should follow it rather than creating an exception workflow that only your team understands. If the organization expects certain documentation artifacts for compliance, like system descriptions, responsibility matrices, or evidence repositories, your implementation strategy should include producing those artifacts in the expected format. The reason this matters is that auditors and internal reviewers often evaluate not only whether the control exists, but whether it fits the established governance model. When you align, you reduce friction because you are not constantly explaining why you are different. Alignment also requires careful handling of shared services and common controls, because organizations often expect systems to inherit protections rather than duplicating them. If the organization operates a central identity service, a central logging platform, and standard network boundary protections, it may expect your system to use them as the default. Implementing independent alternatives can create policy conflicts, increase cost, and complicate incident response because monitoring becomes fragmented. A new learner might think redundancy is always good, but in governance, redundancy that is not coordinated can actually reduce security by creating blind spots and inconsistent data. Alignment means you integrate with shared services in the manner required to be within their scope, and you document that integration so your inherited control claims are defensible. It also means you understand the operational expectations tied to those services, like who responds to alerts and how onboarding is maintained. Shared services are often the backbone of compliance at scale, so aligning with them is one of the strongest ways to avoid gaps. Another alignment challenge is the difference between a control being implemented and a control being implemented in the required way. For example, you might have multi-factor authentication in place, but if the organization's policy requires it for all privileged actions and your system only requires it at login, you may be misaligned. You might have encryption for stored data, but if the policy requires specific key management practices and your implementation does not follow the key handling rules, you may be misaligned. You might have training, but if the policy requires annual training and your team's approach is ad hoc, you may be misaligned. These differences are rarely visible if you only talk in broad terms, which is why alignment requires mapping your implementation details to the organization's required parameters and evidence expectations. You do not need to name tools, but you do need to ensure that the behaviors and results match the requirement language. A control that is partially implemented can be risk-reducing, but it can still fail compliance if it misses required elements. You also need to align control implementation with organizational risk tolerance and decision-making practices, because risk acceptance is a governance act, not a technical act. If your system has constraints that prevent full implementation of a control, you might implement mitigating controls and request a formal exception. Alignment means you follow the organization's exception process, including who can approve it, how long it lasts, and how it is reviewed. It also means you document the rationale and the compensating measures in the organization's standard format, so the risk is visible and trackable. A common misalignment is when a system team treats exceptions as informal agreements, like an email thread that gets lost, which leads to compliance failures later. Another misalignment is when teams accept risk without involving the appropriate risk owner, which can create governance conflict. When you align, you treat exceptions and risk decisions as part of the compliance system, not as private shortcuts. A particularly important area of alignment is documentation and evidence management, because even strong controls can be judged weak if evidence is scattered, inconsistent, or not retained. Organizations often have expectations for where evidence lives, how it is labeled, how long it is kept, and who can access it. They may also have expectations for documentation review cycles and version control, which affects whether evidence is trusted. If your team stores evidence in personal folders or inconsistent formats, you create risk that evidence will be lost when staff change roles. Alignment means you store evidence in a shared, controlled location and you use consistent naming and retention practices so that evidence can be produced quickly. It also means you define what evidence is required for each control and ensure that evidence is generated as part of normal operations, not generated only when an audit is announced. When evidence is designed into operations, compliance becomes routine and less stressful. Alignment also involves communication, because organizational expectations are often expressed through stakeholders who may not speak in control language. Business owners may talk about customer trust and service availability, legal teams may talk about obligations and disclosure, and security teams may talk about monitoring and response. Your job is to implement controls in ways that satisfy these expectations without confusing terms or promising things you cannot deliver. For example, if the organization expects uptime commitments, Availability controls must be implemented with realistic recovery planning and monitoring. If the organization expects strict data handling rules, access and sharing controls must be implemented with clear enforcement and consistent labeling. If the organization expects incident response coordination, your system must route incidents into the central process rather than handling everything privately. Alignment is not only technical fit, it is operational and cultural fit, because controls must be used by people and must integrate into organizational workflows. When you implement controls that fit how people actually work, compliance becomes more sustainable. By the end of this lesson, the key skill is that you can align your control implementation with both organizational expectations and compliance requirements so that security and compliance reinforce each other instead of pulling in different directions. You treat organizational standards and shared services as default building blocks and integrate with them in a way that preserves inherited control coverage and evidence quality. You verify that controls are implemented not just in concept, but in the specific ways required by policies, parameters, and documentation expectations, avoiding informal practices that cannot be proven. You handle deviations and exceptions through formal governance processes so risk decisions are visible and approved by the right stakeholders. You design evidence management as part of normal operations so proof is consistent and durable. When you can do all of this, you create a system that not only has controls, but has controls that fit the organization's compliance machine, making assessments smoother, operations clearer, and risk management more trustworthy.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.